into the webinar. First of all, welcome again. My name is Michael Van Wagenen, and I am an associate professor of history at Georgia Southern University outside the beautiful city of Savannah. I also run the public history graduate program here at the university. I would like to welcome you to the National Association of Scholars webinar, 1848, Manifest Destiny in the Mexican-American War. Specifically, I would like to thank Chris Kendall for bringing us all together today, and thank Chance Layton for handling our technical requirements to make this webinar possible. So thank you to both of you. We are privileged today to hear from three distinguished scholars, David Heidler, Robert Mary, and John Pinheiro, addressing issues related to manifest destiny and the United States invasion of its southern neighbor in 1846. The Mexican-American, or U.S.-Mexican War, as some of us refer to it, remains highly controversial. Indeed, the events of 175 years ago remain relevant to U.S. diplomacy, foreign policy, and culture to this day. My own work is focused on the enduring legacies of the war for Mexicans, Americans, and various groups within both of those countries. In the course of my studies of this conflict, I encountered the research and writings of all three of our guests, so I'm very excited to hear from them today. Before I introduce our speakers, let me quickly review our format for the webinar. Each of our scholars will discuss their topics for 12 to 14 minutes. We will let all three speak before we take about 30 minutes at the end for a more formal question and answer session. Please use the question and answer feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen under Q&A, there you can write your questions and we will see them. I'd also ask, if you have a preference for who you would like to answer a specific question, to please put that in there as well. If not, I will address the question generally to the panel of our three speakers. So now on to our guests. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. David Heidler, who is a historian and former professor at the University of Southern Colorado. After more than half a century of pondering America's past, David's only firm conclusion is that perhaps another 5 decades of study could begin to lift the veil obscuring the people who lived in it. While awaiting this revelation, he is careful about judging their capers because he sympathizes with their trials. In surveying all events, he keeps in mind the observation of novelist L.P. Hartley, quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there," unquote. With his wife, Jean, he has co-authored a number of works, including The Mexican War, Manifest Destiny, and most recently, The Rise of Andrew Jackson, Myth, Manipulation, and the Making of Modern Politics. Dr. Heidler will be speaking on the Texas annexation controversy as it pertained to the slavery debate and how it destroyed the Van Buren and Clay candidacies in 1844. Next, Mr. Robert Mary. And Mr. Mary is the former editor of the American Conservative and longtime Washington journalist and publishing executive. His Washington career, spanning nearly 45 years, has included stints as a governmental and political reporter, publishing executive, commentator, and author. He has published 5 books on American history and foreign policy, including President McKinley, Architect of the American Century, and A Country of Vast Designs, James K Polk, The Mexican War, and the Conquest of the American Continent. Mr. Mary will be addressing President Polk's temperament, personality, and motivations. He will further explore how the lingering issues of expansion shaped his reputation in history. Last, Dr. John C. Pinheiro is professor of history at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Prior to joining the Aquinas faculty in 2004, he was assistant editor of the presidential series of the papers of George Washington at the University of Virginia. Dr. Pinheiro also is the consulting editor on James K Polk for the American President Resource at the University of Virginia's Miller Center of Public Affairs. He is the author of books and articles of the American Republic, the early American Republic, including the award-winning Missionaries of Republicanism, A Religious History of the Mexican-American War. His newest book is The American Experiment in Ordered Liberty. Dr. Pinheiro will address Manifest Destiny sentiment, the reason different groups supported it, and the role it played in American self-identity and view of Mexicans. We will now proceed in the order of our introductions, but first let us give a warm virtual hand to our speakers, however we do that these days. And we'll turn it over to Dr. Heidler.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that kind introduction, and I'm glad to be participating in the panel today. In looking at this, I thought I'd lead off by addressing an overview, but also how things became crystallized in the 1840s around the concept of American expansion and the way it intermingled with the other great contentious issue of the day, which was slavery. We all know that John O'Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny in 1845. That gives the impression that the expansionist impulse was a product of mid-19th century Americans, when in fact it was a feature of the American experience from the earliest days of British colonization. It's obviously true, though, that when O'Sullivan did describe the expansionist impulse, he was talking about a new phase of an old imperative, and did so at a time when other pressing imperatives, slavery being primary among them, had begun to intermingle with expansionism to create the convulsive sectional crisis that would lead to the Civil War. Now, what we see happening in the lead up to the 1844 election is a rather unhealthy political environment developing in which candidates have to carefully calibrate words and obscure long-held positions to appeal to select portions of the electorate and more importantly, avoid alienating very significant portions of the electorate. That was a situation that both Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren found themselves in leading up to the election of 1844, because quite unexpectedly, the issue of Texas annexation reemerged as a burning topic at the end of 1843. The reasons for this are varied. We don't need to get into some of them. One of them, of course, is the fact that the economic situation was improving. The residual impact of the Panic of 1837 was beginning to ebb. But Texas also combined the two most contentious issues, as I pointed out, that of territorial acquisition and slavery. For almost a decade, these things had kept Texas annexation questions in abeyance. Ever since Texas had gained independence, caution was the watchword in dealing with the issue. Both Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren had rebuffed Texas overtures. Domestically, a prudent design. In terms of international circumstances, it was perilous because foreign players, especially Great Britain, saw Texas as a trading partner that would allow them to avoid American tariffs. And at the same time, they saw Texas as a potential protectorate that could act as a bar, a fence against American expansion in North America and to the west, to the Pacific. British abolitionists also have their own ideas about Texas as potentially a laboratory as well as a catalyst for their cause, which was occurring at the precise time that Southern slave owners were becoming very alarmed over domestic abolitionist moves. The question then became intensely sectional and starkly so, with the North adamantly opposed to annexation of Texas and the South enthusiastically endorsing it. Thus, we have the classic damned if you do and damned if you don't circumstance that made untenable the positions that both Clay and Van Buren had been holding throughout 1843, which was to avoid the question of Texas altogether by defining it as a distraction that most people didn't really care about. And this was patently untrue, as became apparent at the beginning of 1844, when John Tyler, under some prodding from Andrew Jackson, made it impossible to ignore Texas by aggressively pushing for annexation, abandoning all prudence seeking annexation by any means and at all costs. This accelerated after Daniel Webster resigned as Secretary of State in May of 1843. So that a year later, we have a treaty with Texas, with the Republic of Texas, for annexation that is put before the Senate in April of 1844. This forced both Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren's hand, as it was meant to come out and stake out a position on the issue of what had become immediate annexation. And they both did this separately from motives that were somewhat similar, but had roots in the same long-held position of opposition to annexation on the basis of slavery and on the basis of a sense of international decorum regarding Mexico. The unfortunate aspect of their announcements, however, was the near simultaneity of it. The fact that they appeared on the same day in different Washington newspapers gave the appearance of cooperation. And this prima facie evidence of cooperation led to two very important consequences. The first one was that Andrew Jackson denounced his former protege and backed James K Polk for the Democratic nomination. It had been Van Buren's virtually assured his nomination until the April publication, the National Intelligencer of his letter to William Hammond, which staked out his position on annexation as in opposition. Van Buren could not be nominated after that at the Democratic Convention. And as it proved, Clay could not win in the general election. In a way, Van Buren was luckier in that his death sentence was immediate. Clay's was a protracted ordeal in which he tried to save himself by writing a series of letters that only made things worse. And finally rendered to him a nomination for the Whig candidacy that was increasingly worthless. Polk's victory set the course for the confrontation with Mexico, the larger meaning of which my colleagues, especially Robert Mary, will elaborate on in due course in just a few minutes. But for the brief time I have remaining, I'd like to contemplate briefly what a Clay presidency would have meant had he won the election in 1844. In the first place, it would have certainly avoided the confrontation with Mexico that the Polk administration embarked upon that led to the war. If we don't have a Mexican war in the mid-1840s, we don't have a number of events that contribute materially and directly to the growing sectional crisis that goes into full bore in the 1850s. In the absence of that, it is difficult to see the events leading or ensuing from that crisis occurring, the principal one being the Civil War. We might not have had a civil war had Henry Clay been elected president in 1844. If we don't have a civil war, all things are alloyed. If we don't have the sectional crisis, if we don't have this discussion in the 1850s, we're going to have it at some point, because the moral issues surrounding slavery, whether the Republic was going to be an empire of liberty, as Jefferson had envisioned, or one based and blemished by slavery, as was developing, was going to have to be hashed out sooner or later. And as Lincoln was famously say in 1861, if the tug must come, let it come now. There is that advantage of having the sectional crisis come to its ugly fruition in the 1860s secession waves, 1860, 61, and the war that follows. we eradicate slavery in this country violently and permanently, conclusively, as a result of the events of the 1840s. But on the other hand, it is attempting, to the point of tantalizing, to consider the fact that a country without the Civil War would have had a completely different demographic makeup and would have had time, as other places in the world had time, to thrash out these moral questions and seek political solutions that were not so radical and not so disruptive to the American polity. It is a question, I think, probably worthy of taking up in a brief way in the Q&A. Possibly some of the audience will find it compelling. In any event, that in sum is a very superficial and brief overview of what happened regarding Texas and the annexation question in the election of 1844. And I'm sure now my esteemed colleague, Robert Mary, will proceed to tell us what Mr. Polk and his administration was all about.
Well, thank you, David. And I want to thank Chris Kendall for putting this together. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to begin with the question that Whigs throughout America were asking upon the occasion of James K. Polk becoming the Democratic nominee for president in 1844. They asked, who is James K. Polk? So I want to ask, who was this guy? Well, he was certainly did not light up a room when he entered. And it can be said that he was average in size. I once described him as small of stature and drab of temperament. One contemporary wag said that if he hadn't had his suits cut a size or two large for his body, he would have been merely the merest tangible fraction of a president. The man had almost no mirth or no sense of humor to speak of. He was a man of tremendous sanctimony, which was not a particularly appealing trait. And he didn't much like people. He didn't trust them. He didn't trust him, and he was cynical about him. But, and this was the key to his personality, he'd been underestimated for these things all of his life, and he knew it, and he played on it. He knew that he possessed some special traits. He might have been a smaller than life figure, but he harbored larger than life ambitions. First, he possessed an analytical brilliance. He was able to understand the course of events, how events were interacting and shaping themselves, as well as the people who got involved in those events. Second, he possessed a zest for bold action. He was capable of making very risky decisions when the stakes were high, with the idea of getting a big victory, even though there was a prospect of very big defeats. And he possessed, third, an ironclad persistence, a resolve to complete and to bring about anything that he set out to accomplish. And on top of that, I would say that he was a man of some considerable vision. So the question is, how did all these traits contribute to the history of his time? A time, which we know, as has been said right here today, was characterized by this concept, this passion that was brewing in America of manifest destiny. So we're going to get to, we've talked about Texas and Mexico, and we'll talk more about it, and I'll be happy to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about the Oregon Territory, because I think that was an interesting distillation of all of this in a way that isn't complicated by the slavery question and the war question. So as we know, Oregon Territory, the great Northwest, if you want to call it that, as we do now, was jointly occupied by Great Britain and the United States of America. Everyone agreed that this had to be settled through some kind of negotiation, and there had been negotiations for decades in trying to establish where the line would be drawn, what the Brits would control and what would go to America. And for a long time, the American position was, well, we have the 49th parallel. moving forward from the Lake of the Woods in Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. Let's just extend that all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Okay, great. We said that would work pretty well. It has precedence. The Brits said, well, that's not bad, but let's extend that 49th parallel to the Columbia River and then extend the line down along the river, which meant that most of what is now Washington State would go to the Brits and it's part of Canada, and the rest would go to the United States. And that was the stalemate. That was the logjam. So then along comes James K. Polk in his inaugural address in March of 1845. And he declares that the US's right to the entire territory, that our claim to the entire territory is clear and unquestionable. This was extremely incendiary. And the Brits went crazy. The Times of London said those are words of war. Members of the parliament were waxing obdurate and bellicose against the United States and against Polk, particularly James Buchanan, who was Polk's Secretary of State, was scared to death. He thought we were going to end up in a war. He thought Polk didn't know what he was doing. And then Polk did an interesting thing. He made a proposal to the Brits. He backed off from that statement that he made in his inaugural address almost immediately, which raises questions of its own. And he said to the Brits, look, I'm back to the 49th parallel. Why don't you just take the 49th parallel and we'll be fine? Well, the Brits didn't, not only didn't go along with that, they didn't even discuss it. The British ambassador, Richard Pakenham, didn't even send it to London. He just said no. Now Polk is the one that's mad because he felt that they should have at least made a counteroffer or entered into some negotiations, but they refused. Buchanan immediately said, not surprisingly, boss, you're going to have to make another proposal. They rejected this one. Polk says, I'm not going to negotiate with myself. You tell them, you tell Pakenham, he's going to go over and see him, that I'm out of it. I'm not going to make any more recommendations. I'm not going to make any more offers. The ball's in your court, and you guys are going to have to make a counteroffer if you want to talk about it at all. Well, that was quite an impasse, but over time, an idea emerged that Polk embraced rather quickly, which was, it kind of gave the Brits not very much of what they wanted, but enough for a kind of a face-saving aspect of it all. And they said, okay, we'll take the 49th parallel as far as the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I know about all this because I grew up in Washington State. And then it'll go down around the southern tip of Vancouver Island, so that all of Vancouver Island, rather than being split, which didn't make any sense anyway, would go to the Brits, would be part of Canada. And that was enough. Britain had other things on its mind in the mid-1840s, the Corn Laws and turbulence in Europe. And so they said, let's just get rid of this thing. So what's sort of fascinating about all this, it seems to me, is how Polk sort of wended his way through this delicate situation. And in fact, there was war talk, and it could have been a war if the Brits had really decided that they wanted to really be bellicose about this. But he was willing to take that risk for a huge amount of territory. All of Oregon territory was 36,000 square miles. So something more than half of that came to the United States of America. So this was a reflection, in my view, of Polk's expansionist zeal and his vision. And I think in some ways, his brilliance as a kind of a manipulator, an operator on the political scene, on the geopolitical scene. Now that vision was not universally shared. We heard about Henry Clay and the situation regarding Texas annexation. Henry Clay didn't share this vision. In fact, I don't think he understood it. When Polk envisioned the idea of a transcontinental nation, and he wanted it to be created as soon as possible, Henry Clay said, wait, hold it. I don't think there's any particular need for us to go west of the Rocky Mountains. We've got enough on our plate. We don't really want to get embroiled in that kind of a situation. And so he basically was opposed to what Polk was trying to do. So by then, Clay said, let's just wait 30 or 40 years. 30 or 40 years, number one, the country was not prepared to wait 30 or 40 years for that territory, for moving into those lush lands with those wonderful ports and their great agricultural opportunities. But on top of that, in geopolitical terms, in 30 or 40 years, the game would have been up. The Brits would have had the whole thing. So Polk had the vision, and I think that that's a reflection of who James K. Polk was. But then let's talk a little bit about Texas. When Tyler decided that he was going to enter into those negotiations with Texas about annexation, Polk was nowhere to be seen on that scene for the simple reason that he was drastically trying to save his political career from what looked like total and utter ruin. He'd been in the House for 14 years. He'd been Speaker of the House. He'd been governor of Tennessee. But he ran for re-election with the idea that he was going to get re-elected and then he was going to position himself to run for president after Van Buren. And he lost. He lost to a kind of a backwoods upstart by the name of Lean Jimmy Jones, who was kind of a jokester and ran rings around Polk, who was a serious-minded guy. And Lean Jimmy Jones kind of made fun of him. And he beat him. 2 years later, Polk went back against Lean Jimmy Jones with the idea of reclaiming the governorship that he had lost. And he lost again to Lean Jimmy. And so the result was that he looked like he was finished. He thought maybe he could rehabilitate himself by becoming the vice presidential choice of Van Buren, but Van Buren gave him the cold shoulder. He wasn't interested at all. And so he was desperately trying to figure out how he could get the vice presidential nomination. And how he ended up being president is a remarkable thing, given that situation. But as David Heidler very correctly explains, that Texas annexation issue killed Van Buren as it did ultimately Clay. So we have the second thing I want to talk about is the Polk's concept for how to deal with the situation with Mexico. And we'll probably get into more details about how that situation evolved and emerged. But Polk came up with an idea of, and I don't think that there was anybody else who was seriously pushing this concept before Polk, to link two things, one of which is well known, and that is Polk's and America's aim of gaining territory from the Mexican government, if possible. And secondly, something that's not that well known and not as well accentuated as it deserves to be in history, and that is the reparations issue, in which many Americans had been abused, sometimes quite horribly, by rogue officials in Mexico, by Mexican citizens. Ship captains and others trying to do business in Mexico were marauded, they were abducted, there were this piracy going on, there were a couple, at least 2 murders took place. And all of these things, a self-respecting nation doesn't allow people from another nation to prey on their citizens, on its citizens, with abandon. And the concept emerged that Mexico was going to have to pay reparations to the people who suffered from these abuses. Now, the Brits and the French suffered the same thing, and the French actually invaded part of Mexico. They went into Veracruz with Marines to get their reparations, and Britain threatened to do the same thing, which they could do because they had the military power to do it and the reach, and got their reparations. But the Mexicans were not very keen on listening to the demands of Americans on this issue. Now, this was a persistent issue. 2 committees of Congress studied it at the behest of Andrew Jackson and came up with the idea that the immediate recourse to war would be legitimate. But let's not do that. Let's give them one last chance. So that was hovering over this whole thing. And Polk's idea was, look, to tell the Mexicans they didn't have the money to pay for this, that we'll pay for it. We'll assume the commitment of reparations that you owe in exchange for land, and we'll be happy to pay more if that seems indicated. That ended up being a part of the final solution when the settlement was reached at Guadalupe Hidalgo. But it was Polk who came up with the concept and posed the concept to the Mexicans, who rejected it immediately. But that's just another small slice of an example of how Polk's thinking in crisis and difficult situations emerged. So those are the things I'll leave, and then we'll get into some discussions. So now, John.
Thank you. I'd like to also thank Chris Kendall, and I think I'm going to pull out of the, we've got Henry Clay on the one hand and Polk on the other, and I'm interested in stepping back a little bit, or a lot really, and looking at manifest destiny sentiment itself. And I think David mentioned that, well, we all know John L. O'Sullivan coined that term, but I want to quote for you from his essay in which he coined that term in 1845, and then unpack it a little bit and talk about the why Americans found that to be such a ready slogan in 1845, and how it helped them to understand what it meant to be an American and just encapsulate it in that term. And then finally how that helped them to define also what a Mexican was. And so what O'Sullivan said, he was mad at Clay. He was mad at the Whigs. And he said they're blocking what Providence, what God in his all-wise plan is doing for us. They're blocking it. It's our destiny. It's not only our destiny, it's our destiny made manifest. In other words, it's obvious who could stand in the way of this. It's like, say, nowadays, who can stand in the way of progress? Who could stand in the way of this expansion? And so he said, quote, our manifest destiny is to overspread and possess the whole of the continent. That's a lot of territory, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. So on the one hand, we have this idea of overspreading and possessing the whole continent. And David is right, territorial expansion was nothing new, certainly for Americans. But what was going to make the Mexican-American War different from, say, the Louisiana Purchase, which of course might have been purchased from France and handed over by the Spanish, but of course these are Indian territories as well. So it's more complicated than just talking about the United States and Mexico. But the Mexican War is going to accomplish this territorial expansion by the sword. And this is why those Americans who could ascribe to territorial expansion, or a republic of republics, or an empire of liberty, as Jefferson termed it, maybe even from the Atlantic to the Pacific, were not necessarily willing to do that in war, thinking that this is not how republics spread. But one way or the other, it seems to be the destiny, so O'Sullivan saying, the Democratic journalist, to overspread and possess. Providence is given to us. What the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government is Republican government. And what I talk about in my Missionaries of Republicanism book is how the idea of Republican government by this time got tied to everything from Anglo-Saxons, however Americans define that, to Protestantism, to arguments that republicanism was not rooted in a Lockean social contract or any kind of a classical republicanism or civic republicanism, but as Lyman Beecher, the evangelist, argued, was actually rooted in the Bible. That if you dug deep enough, and Beecher knew where to dig, you could find it especially in the Old Testament Republican government. So what this produced elsewhere, then what this produced in the United States, was a sense by the 1850s that somehow the Americans are the chosen people, and in the rhetoric surrounding the war, there's a lot of terminology such as pushing the Canaanites into the sea. The chosen people are going to push aside the Canaanites. And how have they been chosen? Well, darn it, they didn't ask for it, but it's been thrust upon them by providence. And so I'm going to take just a moment now then to talk about anti-Catholicism during this time period, because I'm going to use the term, but I want to define it very, very clearly. So in the context of the 1830s, what that label would mean in the United States specifically, it would apply to those who believed a few things. One would be that Catholics were not Christians, and they also then identified the Pope with the Antichrist of the book of Revelation. They propagated best-selling false stories about Catholics, what Richard Hofstadter called the pornography of the Puritan. If I could come up with a great phrase like that, I'd probably write a whole other book about this. And perhaps most importantly, in the context of westward expansion in the war, they were convinced by Beecher and by Samuel F.B. Morse that Jesuits were leading and planning to lead an army of immigrant Catholics against the West. And the goal was a papal orchestrated takeover of the West. And the ultimate goal of that, the end game really, was to destroy republicanism at its source. So that this makes the transcendent meaning of America then is it is this bastion of republicanism, and it's under duress by this wave of Catholic immigrants coming from Europe. And so we have quite easily this nativist strand coming into this concern for the West. And that was made most popular by Lyman Beecher, who warned that Americans had this mission to the world. It had been given them by God, and it hinged on what he called the religious and political destiny of the West. So if America was going to remain a republic, it had to remain Protestant. And if it was going to remain Protestant, then Protestants better get out into the West before the Catholics beat them there. So you could probably see how this might affect relations with Mexico, the officially Catholic country to the south. What happens because of the Texas annexation issue, and in the wake of the Texas Revelation and all the way up through Texas annexation in 1845, is that there's this ready-made discourse for Americans to argue for or against annexing Texas. During the war, it's arguing for or against annexing all of Mexico, some of Mexico, none of Mexico. And Americans start to understand themselves by saying, well, I can't quite tell you what an American is, but I can tell you what we're not. We're not that. So if we're white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, then we're not Catholic, and we're not Indian and darker skinned like the Mexicans. We're economically vibrant. We're not economically backward, and we don't have a turbulent political system, at least compared to Mexico, which saw 14 presidents between the 1820s and the 1840s, and none of them were elected. So Americans are looking at the political instability in Mexico amid the Texas annexation, and they start to think, and you see it in the literature, and you see it in songs, and you see it in politics. And it's the same kind of rhetoric one saw prior to Cherokee removal and in Indian removal more generally. And it's that the Americans deserve this territory because not only will they use it more wisely, but it's providentially theirs. And so there's no real time like the present. And the people on it aren't using it as wisely as the Americans think they will be able to use it. So when it comes to talk about the war, let's say you were an evangelical pacifist. So you opposed war on principle, but in the newspapers at the time and in the pulpit, these pacifists would grudgingly say, well, at least we might drive the Catholic Church from the continent. So at least that might be a good that would come out of this evil war. And the abolitionists, of course, who also were predominantly evangelicals, had a even a more difficult time because they're convinced, even though it doesn't end up this way, but they're convinced that this is a war to spread slavery far, far to the south. That's the slaveocracy, and Polk's at the head of it. But they kind of like the idea. You see this in the soldiers' diaries. You see it in the chaplains. You see it in others. they kind of like the idea of whipping Mexico, not simply because they think they can, not just because more is better in terms of territory, but precisely because spreading Republican government also meant spreading Protestant Christianity. Our tract societies and our missionaries should be in the wake of our armies, Morris said, in the only comment he made about the war. That was kind of how he characterized it in a newspaper at the time. So when Americans say manifest destiny, there's a lot in there. When you're hearing words like providence and Republican government, those might mean different things to different people, but in the 1840s, what Americans are hearing and the way that we see this communicated about Mexico is these are very uniquely Protestant and Anglo-Saxon things. So Anglo-Saxons, by the virtue of their religious and political superiority, deserve to rule over the entire continent. And so Whigs used this discourse to oppose the war, and particularly the All Mexico movement, saying, why would we want to annex 3.5 million non-white Catholics? Democrats tried to take advantage of this and say, think of the missionary opportunities. They're trying to pull from the evangelical support of the Whigs. Think of the missionary opportunities we might have in Mexico. Think of what California can do to send out missionaries into the Pacific Basin and to Asia. So you're a maritime business person, let's say in Massachusetts, and you're in the hotbed of Whiggism, and you oppose territorial expansion for the same reasons really Clay would. But while in the maritime industry, wouldn't San Francisco be a great harbor to have? Not to mention Puget Sound, as we were mentioning. So everybody finds something to support, it seems, when it comes to manifest destiny. So that it's not that the sentiment of territorial expansion is new, but in talking about Mexico, then there's this ready-made discourse to be used where somebody like John C. Calhoun, for instance, can stand up on the floor of the Senate. Calhoun was the Democrat from South Carolina, of course, but he opposed the war because he thought Polk was abusing his executive authority. So I guess that's one thing Calhoun and Lincoln would have agreed on in this case. But when he stands on the floor of the Senate, he says, ours is the government of the white man, quote, unquote. And what he means by that is that it's the government of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and nobody else can really do this. So if we can't annex Mexicans, we can't also empower the president to just conquer who he pleases either, Calhoun's faction would say. There were those who argued that Mexico had been greater when it was ruled by the Aztecs, and it was actually the Spanish Catholics who had ruined the place and created the political and economic disaster that they claimed it was. And then there were others, of course, who said, look, we removed the Cherokee, we fought the Creeks, etc. The Mexicans are Indians, and we're going to treat them the same way. So my point then is, no matter which direction, pro or con, when it comes to supporting the taking of all Mexico at the end of the war or annexing as it ends up a third of Mexico, this discourse that Lyman Beecher and the anti-Catholic and nativist movement helped to shape, it all gets wrapped up easily in this slogan of manifest destiny. So that if you're blocking that destiny, you're actually opposing the word of God. And to stand up and do that in 1840s political discourse in the United States, that's not really going to get you too far. You wouldn't even need a political operative like Slim Jim, or I'm not sure that person's name, Robert. You'll have to fill me in. You'll have to mention that later. But you wouldn't even need somebody as clever as that guy to beat you if you're going to try to stand up and do that. So an American victory might regenerate Mexico by establishing Republican values of civil and religious liberty there. The necessary condition for civil and religious liberty was Protestantism, according to Beecher. More importantly, of course, a successful American campaign would would increase U.S. territory, and then Anglo-Saxons could settle those lands. And this was the surest way to make Republican government and the Republican experiment safe. So the other statement I'd close with that O'Sullivan used was the term missionaries of republicanism, from which I titled one of my books. So you think of missionaries, you might think of Christian evangelists spreading the gospel. But what he said was that U.S. soldiers would be missionaries when they meant to Mexico, but they wouldn't be missionaries of the gospel. They'd be missionaries of something that a good number of Americans by this time couldn't separate from the gospel. That is civil and religious liberty, representative government, republicanism. These two things went hand in hand as far as they were concerned. And because that gave transcendent meaning to America, then that also gave transcendent meaning to the war. Now, lastly, on Polk, I guess I will talk about personality for one moment. Polk did not ascribe to this stuff. I see him as a commercial expansionist. He thinks it's a good idea to have a bicoastal nation. His administration was exploring, putting a canal through an isthmus in Mexico. He understood the future need of such a canal if the United States is going to be present in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. So he's not a typical Jacksonian just thinking about spreading yeoman farmers and maybe even planters as far as the eye can see. He's also not an active anti-Catholic. In fact, he works hard to try to put down this kind of rhetoric because he's so afraid this might turn the war into some kind of a religious war. So Polk, while he's going to take advantage of the manifest destiny rhetoric in the same way he took, I think, political advantage of the bellicose 54-40 or fight rhetoric of his supporters during the election, you're never quite sure. So you could be sure Polk doesn't joke around, but you also can't be quite sure what he really thinks. I think even when he says it in his diary. Presidents know their diaries are going to be read. And so we always have to read them with that in mind, even their secret diary. So I'll close with that quote from Samuel F.B. Morse. He's most famous for the Telegraph, perhaps, but also famous because he really did think the Pope was going to settle in the Mississippi River Valley and try to destroy republicanism at its source. And he said, quote, "The Mexican race is a worn out race, and God in his providence is taking this mode to regenerate them. Whatever may be the opinion of some in relation to the justness or injustice of our quarrel, there ought to be one opinion among all good men. And that should be that the moment should be improved to throw light into that darkened nation." And then he goes on to talk about sending missionaries in the wake of the armies. So I'll close on that note, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Sitting here listening to this reminds me of what exactly drew me to the U.S.-Mexican War back at the beginning of my graduate school experience many years ago. So thank you. Appreciate that. We've had a variety of questions that were submitted during your presentations. We had some, John, you gave me a few that had been submitted to you in advance. So let's tackle a few of those right now. First of all, there were a couple of questions directed regarding perhaps the best, maybe not so hardcore academic biographies of Polk and of Clay. What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
I'm sorry, who did you ask for?
This is for the panel. Polk and Clay, what are some of the better biographies of these two for a popular audience?
I'm not sure. I don't know who has written about Polk for a popular audience, to be honest. If you're going to write for a popular audience, you'd be like David, you write about Clay. Maybe I think I would recommend his book, as I would recommend Robert's A Country of Vast Designs on the Mexican War if I was going to look for what I think is open for a popular audience. Clay, there's much more about Clay, but Polk, I think if you're interested in political history, I'd recommend my mentor's book, The Presidency of James K Polk. I mean, the chapters are short, they're to the point, and it is separated into banking and the Mexican War and Oregon, and it's just very organized all the way through.
Okay. And I should point out that there are, in the chat, we have links to everyone's books here, and those I believe will be sent out to everybody who is here today, as well as a link to this video. So, okay, thank you.
Well, I think it has to be said that David and Jean Heidler have produced, and there's a lot of wonderful clay books, but they produced one that is extremely readable and extremely well researched. So I think that needs to be put on the doc here.
All right, great. Okay, so some reading assignments for you all. Question was, actually, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. And again, I'll put this out to the entire panel. A question of context. From trying to understand Manifest Destiny through the context of this, let me make sure I get it more or less correct. In the context of Spanish and French occupation, as well as Indian removal. Does someone want to tackle those issues in the context of Manifest Destiny?
Well, I will talk about some of the issues surrounding Indian removal. And John mentioned this, that there were things there were these elements within the Louisiana Purchase that became obstacles to settlement and attracted the attention of both the humanitarian and political class as a result. The problems with the demographic makeup of the Southeast and the Northwest, what in those days they called the Southwest, which is now the Southeast, was the fact that there had been a significant undertaking by the federal government beginning in the Washington administration to assimilate Indians into the Republican experiment. This was especially successful with the Cherokee, who had adopted many white customs from the impression that by doing so, they would cease to be exotics and become neighbors. And in large degree, they were successful in emulating white society while integrating traditions and cultures from Cherokee, ancient Cherokee past into those assimilationist designs. This is what makes the Cherokee experience so deplorable as it plays out in the 1820s and especially after 1830 with the Removal Act, in that they had done everything they were supposed to do under the rules set out from Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and even James Monroe. They had done everything that they were supposed to do, and yet it hadn't been enough. Even the courts failed them, and as it turned out, they were driven west on the Trail of Tears, and as part of a massive rearrangement of populations that was undertaken primarily out of land greed. As John mentions, this plays into a sort of a rationalization among the Jacksonians of one, we're protecting the culture of these people by removing them from the corrosive influence of white settlement, and therefore putting them out in sort of an Edenic thing that happens to be Oklahoma. But at the other parties, they're not using the land wisely. They're not. They were improper stewards of the full potential of a land that was both fecund and should be available. And as a result, the moral imperatives behind removal take on this somewhat messianic quality that is from even a close examination preposterous, and from some remove really appalling. The realities of Indian-white relations as they were playing out in the early 19th century suggest that there were other ways that this could have been done that would have been more humanitarian and more effective. But the Jacksonians were in a hurry. And as Robert Mary says, Clay had not the vision with a 3-decade timeline. The Americans were impatient, and that time was a wasted. And this is never more true than when the clash occurs between the proponents of removal and those who were attempting to resist it.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions earlier on related to the connection between the U.S.-Mexican War and the Civil War, and one leading to the other. Would someone like to address that in a little bit of detail?
Well, I'll just say that it's a straight line. The annexation, the independence of Texas led inevitably to the annexation of Texas, or to the issue of annexing Texas. The annexation of Texas led to conflicts with the Mexican authorities. Conflicts with the Mexican authorities led ultimately and perhaps inevitably to a war between the United States and Mexico. And the war between the United States and Mexico led to the acquisition of those lands that then became a almost impossible subject of tensions and conflict of attitudes between the North and the South.
David, I found it interesting the potential to speculate what would a Clay presidency have led to. How would this country be potentially different? And I always think back that the perhaps greatest loss for Clay, because of losing the election and thus entering into a war with Mexico, is that his son was killed, of course, in the Battle of Buena Vista, and so that became a very personal loss to him as well. So yeah, there's a lot to think about in that.
Well, I have a question for David here. David, I know that Clay lost the election in '44 to Polk by something in the neighborhood of 32 to 36,000 votes, but I don't recall the Electoral College. Do you? Was it less close in the Electoral College than it was in the popular vote?
Yes, it was, but that's only because New York told the tale, and New York had a significant number of electoral votes. That was the difference. If Clay had managed to take New York, he would have won the presidency. And as you know, Robert, the amount of fraud in the election was astonishing. It was a New York alone. The naturalization of immigrant populations was wholesale and untrammeled. In other places, Louisiana, for instance, there were certain parishes that reported vote totals that were 170% larger than the populations of the parishes. So the irregularities in the election were galling, but at the same time, the closeness of it was troubling, in as much as Polk, Tyler first. Tyler's behavior is quite troubling in that after that election, as close as it was, as you point out, they have Tyler takes it as a mandate to proceed with annexation by any means. As it turns out, it's not a treaty because they can't get the 2/3 in the Senate to ratify it. So they simply do it by joint resolution. And that is a procedure that is highly irregular in terms of such a momentous decision. And that would be pivotal to the future of the country in so many ways. One of the things that disturbed Northerners, as well as just Northerners, not just abolitionists, was the fact that the Texas Enabling Act allowed and still allows Texas to split into 5 states because of the expansive territory, which was deemed somewhat ungovernable because of its nature and also its size. But the Enabling Act had the potential of bringing not just Texas into the Union, but 4 additional slave states, which would forever tip the balance as far as anyone could see. The attempt to balance Texas with Oregon, which was pretty much the promise that made both marginally palatable to the 2 sections, would have been completely obliterated. The Oregon issue would have been completely off the table if Texas had been able to multiply itself so effectively. So yes, the closeness of the election was one of the issues that troubled the political community as they moved forward from it.
I can add a comment to that, that my understanding of the New York election isn't that the difference in votes is so much a matter of fraud as it was that more serious abolitionists, rather than supporting the Whig Party, supported the Liberty Party. And that siphoned some votes away from the Whigs. And so Polk squeaks through in New York and takes it as a mandate, really. This squeaky election takes it as a mandate to do what he said he would do in his campaign, which was to re-annex Texas even. He had talked about re-annexation during the election campaign.
Well,
right?
Yeah, you're exactly right, because Jackson had started the Gilmer letter earlier in the spring of, I think, February of '44, where he was ostensibly answering a correspondent, Gilmer, that he had broached an old bugaboo of his, which was that John Quincy Adams has sold the country out with the Transcontinental Treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty, by excluding Texas from the deal. And as a consequence, the treaty by all rights should have included Texas, and therefore we weren't actually annexing Texas, we were re-annexing it, because it should have been part of the United States from the get-go. And that was the impetus behind immediate annexation, was that it was merely the formalization what it was, should have been a de facto circumstance. Yes, and you're right, James Birney's candidacy hurt the Whigs just the way that Tyler's retirement from his candidacy helped the Democrats, because Tyler was ostensibly going to run until he was promised, I think, a trip to the court of St. James as minister, which never panned out, but he was bought that way in something of a corrupt bargain by the Polk people. And so Tyler quitting, Birney staying in, yes. But the fraud is, they had jokes about the pipe layers in New York City, in Manhattan, or had laid enough pipe to siphon off enough votes to elect a Polk to the presidency. So I think yes, the fraud and the persistence of the Liberty Party, which took a fairly significant number of votes in New York, did play in.
Thank you very much. A lot of my research has dealt with Mexican perspective of manifest destiny in the war after the war ended. But we got a question about how did Mexicans, what was their point of view, their perspective in the years leading up to and including the war? Someone would like to answer that one.
Michael, could you say it again? I'm not sure I heard the last part.
So a question was asking about the point of view, the perspective of Mexico about manifest destiny as we see it developing through the 1830s, 1840s. how are they viewing this?
Well, they were alarmed by it. They found it to be very troubling. Well, everyone was. Internationally, it struck many as an aggressive a stance to cloak what was pretty much naked aggression, diplomatically, and also, as it turned out, militarily. Mexico was, as John has pointed out, and this is a valid criticism of the Mexican Republic, it never was able to achieve a level of stability in an environment troubled by barracks rebellions that installed presidents with an alarming frequency, and by characters such as Santa Anna, who exploited this situation shamelessly, so that the Republic from its outset was troubled by bad leadership, exploitative manipulation among its elite class, and a really remarkable dichotomy of wealth and poverty, which was a further destabilizing element. The circumstance of the American to the north, I'm not sure that there's anything more emblematic of the problems Mexico had than that their solution to the underpopulated Texas frontier was to people it with Americans. That, I think, is illustrative of the difficulties that Mexico was encountering, both demographically and geographically. If you think about it, Mexico City is incredibly farther away from San Francisco than Washington, D.C. is. And so they had a far-flung, expansive territory that they had inherited from the Spanish Empire, and a great deal of difficulty in governing it. And so when they began to look at the impresario system and accepted it as they did under the terms that were clearly unenforceable, and ultimately upbraiding of any kind of conciliatory polity within the Mexican Union, you have an indication of the problems that Mexico was having internally, and that affected in many ways their worldview. No matter how much silver they produced, no matter how many impresario grants were placed into Texas, no matter how much they importuned the international community for loans and for international recognition, mind prestige, they remained in the thrall of British bankers and American expansionists, and that they were defensive, they were touchy, and they behaved in ways that were antithetical to their interests, not only in accepting the impresario system, but also in adopting what was an unrealistic attitude to Polk's overtures. By that point, diplomatically, there was a time to cut losses and begin to think about saving the situation. That was not on the table. No government could survive in Mexico City that even contemplated it. And when that is the situation, that is another kind of unhealthy political environment.
Thank you. We have a question here regarding the Founding Fathers and how these ideas from the 1840s of manifest destiny, how did they fit ultimately with the Founding Fathers and their original plan for the United States? That's opened up again to the panel.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. It's a very interesting question, and the Founding Fathers created this system. It was brilliant and the product of the genius of the people who came together miraculously in Philadelphia and around, and relying on an awful lot of scholarship and thinking and pontificating that had gone on before. and basically unleashed this energy. And I guess I would say that I don't know what any individual of our founding fathers would say when they saw the Mexican War, for U.S. and Mexican War, for example, or for that matter, the work of William McKinley or many, many others. But they unleashed this incredible civic and cultural energy that made the expansion of these people, the Americans on the continent of North America, inevitable and inexorable and almost impossible to stop. I agree to everything that David was saying regarding Mexico, and I would note, I don't remember the years exactly, but pretty much at the beginning of the American Republic, population of the United States, white population, was right in the neighborhood of 3 million, and I think that Mexico was at 4 million. When Mexico reached 7 million population, which was a couple of decades later or so, I don't remember the years, as I say, the American population was 17 million. And in terms of wealth production, the Americans sort of leaving the Mexican people and the Mexican government, the Mexican system in the dust is even more stark. So which raises a question of whether there was any possibility, as David said, without the population and without the sort of geographical reach, and one could say also without the financial energy, whether there was any way that Mexico was going to be able to hang on to those lands in any event. History is in large measure and significant measure a story of the results of power differentials, and the power differential that emerged on the North American continent was absolutely huge and was going to have huge implications, whether there was a U.S.-Mexican war or a civil war or whatever.
Okay. John, I think we may have lost you for a minute there.
You did.
So let me pose the question to you. We're discussing the manifest destiny in the context of the ideals of the founding fathers and your research in the early republic. How do you find those go together?
In the context of the founding fathers, I think, I always say when it comes to the founders, it depends on not only which founder we're talking about, but at what time period we're talking about that founder. Think of Madison, the nationalist of the 1780s, as opposed to Madison, the Republican of the 1790s, for instance. But in general, there's a sense, and Washington certainly had this. So I use George Washington as an example. There's a sense that the greatness of America lay to the west, and in a lot of ways, the Revolutionary War had been fought to open up lands that Great Britain had closed to Americans after the French and Indian War. And Washington was convinced, though he turned out to be wrong, that the Potomac River would be the gateway to the west in ways that it did not end up being. But I can't think of any particular founders who advocated going out to conquer, say, the French or the Spanish. And a lot of this developed in the 1820s with democracy. But the Washington administration did, however, seek through treaty and war to secure the Northwest Territory for the United States through treaty and war with the Indian peoples living there. So one place to turn here is Tocqueville's book on democracy in America, and he just uses geography, leaves out the ideology of expansion and everything I've talked about. And he says, look, you've got the United States, it's obviously expanding territorially and growing in prosperity. And in the 1830s, he says it's not going to happen for a couple decades, but it's going to run into, what he calls the Spanish, even in that book. It's going to run into the Spanish at some point, and there'll be a conflict. And it happened much earlier than he thought, but to him, I think it was just kind of geographical destiny, that there was something different about these countries clashing in North America that made them qualitatively different when they clashed than in Europe. But I don't get a great sense of straddling the whole continent. Jefferson, for instance, maybe somebody mentioned this while I was struggling to restore internet here, but Jefferson, for instance, talked about maybe there'd be 5, 6, 7 republics someday. He didn't think a republic, I mean, I think he was concerned that the republic already was too big. But then when he saw the dangers of the Federalist Party, of course, he thought, well, maybe diffusing the population and buying Louisiana would be a good idea to ensure the United States never had a central power located in a metropolis like a modern nation state would have. That was, again, one of the things de Tocqueville said was what prevented tyranny in the United States was it didn't have a metropolis like we have now, with a very strong central government like we have now. And so that's how I would answer that question. So thanks for asking.
Thank you, John. We had a couple of questions I think I might be able to package as one. And that is, and we're pushing up against our time limit here, so maybe I can have each of you discuss your experience with this, and before we go to final statements here, but and I'll try and pull in as many of the questions together as I can on this one. But again, it's a question about perspective. And now, what are some of the challenges or dangers even of trying to interpret Manifest Destiny through our 21st century perspective? And, you know, and maybe the benefits. I mean, I'm going to flip that around a little bit, you know, maybe you find some benefits. And of course, you know, we're now in an era where we have a lot more scholarship coming from Mexico addressing this issue. And so maybe if each of you could take a few minutes to talk about your own experiences and the challenges and advantages of our 21st century lens. Why don't we, David?
Yeah, I'll just mention that your introduction of me with something of my philosophy of how to view the past using L.P. Hartley's observation, which was in his novel, I think, in The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So the idea that somehow or other we can make judgments that are anything other than judgmental about what people were doing to confront the ordeals, the tribulations, the trials that they pass through, has the benefit of hindsight, which is always satisfying, but hardly enlightening, and it commits some amount of injustice to people who, like us, have not the ability to see tomorrow, and often are seen very blind to the things that they were doing that were going to have consequences of a dire nature. I mean, it is hard to see people not seeing the Civil War on the horizon. The fact is that they're talking about reconciliation and what to do about it as a perfectly reasonable political course. I mean, savvy politicians in 1860 in the post-Lincoln election, they don't have a sense of this being momentous. And it is only in looking back that we can say, that's where it went wrong, or here's where they could have done this differently, that we can make the proper decisions. And so when we start making those decisions and freight them with the sanctimony, we're not doing anyone favors, certainly not the past. We're not really doing much to enlighten ourselves either. We have to understand the human condition first. And I think that's one of the things that John has addressed today very effectively. In the human condition as it was arising out of certain sets of beliefs that grasped the imagination of Americans and became popular, not just widespread, but popular, which meant they were persuasive. Understanding that is a key to perhaps avoiding the pitfalls of it in our own time. It's certainly worth considering. But to look back and say, no, these people were wrong, they are incapable of redemption through anything other than an outright denunciation and condemnation and erasure in many in many instances, that is counterproductive. It is as counterproductive as any form of ignorance can be.
Okay, thank you. Robert, what are your feelings on that?
So I'm struck as we look at the expansionism of the 1840s and Manifest Destiny, and then the war came along and sort of set us back. Then came the amazing industrial expansion and expansionism in the economic realm. And then with the 1890s and the emergence of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, there was a whole new wave of expansionism. And what I see as I look back on that is a kind of a tension between the expansionism that John was talking about in terms of a cultural affinity or identity, the Anglo-Protestant concept of identity that was pushing people, and definitely was, along with the expressions that emerged, sometimes somewhat on the fringe and then more and more at the center, certainly with Woodrow Wilson, that we have a mission to change the world. So I don't see too much difference aside from the fact that the missionary zeal, the messianic aspect of American expansionism has become much more front and center. And it was definitely front and center when, after 9/11, when we went into Iraq without really understanding what impact, what connection that had to 9/11. This whole 20-year Afghanistan mission of attempting to somehow create a society there that's more like ours is part of that as well. And it's all expansionist. So I would say that it's a part of our birthright and something that is both something we can look back on with a certain amount of pride, but also with a certain amount of concern about where this all leads. I wrote a book about American foreign policy and the ideas that were driving American foreign policy after the invasion of Iraq, because I was so opposed to it, and went into a lot of this stuff with regard to, where does this come from? Why do we feel that we are the people who should be remaking societies elsewhere? And I think that it's a fool's mission.
Thank you very much, Robert. John, we're glad to have you back.
I'm glad as well. I apologize.
No, I've dealt with this myself, having taught via Zoom for a year. I feel your pain today because I've experienced it. I don't know if you heard the initial question, and that is, and this is becoming sort of a final statement of sorts here too, a final remark, just addressing, in terms of your perspective of having your research and in the context of doing this from the 21st century, some of the dangers, pitfalls, or advantages that you may feel and have.
I mean, anytime an historian writes, he writes from the time period he's living in, of course. So I recall I had a lot of questions that were being shaped when I was writing the Manifest Ambition book between 2002 and 06, somewhere in there, 05, 06. And they were shaped by the nation building exercise in Iraq, for instance, and some of the issues surrounding the start of that war as well. And that's a pretty normal thing. And I guess that's what makes, in some ways, history relevant. But as an academic, I'm always nervous of this term relevancy. And I tell my liberal arts college students that we're almost aiming for irrelevancy here, in the sense that we're not looking to be relevant to today necessarily so much as we're looking to try to get at the truth of things as best we can. I think I heard David, before I cut out the last time, mention the past as a foreign country. And so we're interpreting the past as best we can based on the evidence we have. And so while on the one hand, the Mexican War just isn't one of those wars that most Americans like to talk about. It's not just because it's overshadowed by the Civil War, but it's really hard to spin the conquest of a third of another country into anything other than the conquest of a third of another country. That's on the one hand. But when you start to weigh these things comparatively to border making and unmaking in the Americas during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, to the nationalist movements in Europe and the expansion of borders during the time period. Even we could stretch that to the Civil War, of course, making a real nation state through war, as Bismarck was trying to do in 1860s and 70s in Germany. At least that context tells us something and helps. And so I don't meet a lot of Californians who really would give up California. They might move from California for a variety of reasons, but in terms of calling the Mexican War unjust as Lincoln did, it'd be a pretty easy argument to talk about justice and injustice when it comes to the war. Where do we stand this many years later? How does it affect contemporary politics? I'm not even sure. In fact, I don't think historians are best suited to answer that question, but we can provide a lot of different viewpoints if we can keep, if we can appraise things in their own time period. And so I guess where I might differ with David a little bit on this is I do think, and maybe this was, I'm not sure if this, whose formulation this was, Daniel Borston or Will Durant, but this formulation that there's enough people in the 1840s arguing against spreading Republican government by the sword, or saying, here, take this Constitution, it'll work great. Simón Bolívar had called the U.S. Constitution the greatest constitution in the Western world, but it's not going to work for us, he said. He kind of got it, that you can't just export these sorts of things. I don't think that's what the anti-Catholic racialist attitudes towards Mexicans are saying, though. I think it's deeper than that. In other words, I mean, it's certainly more than just a cultural statement they're making. But there's a great complexity there. I think if we could pull the Mexican War out from under the Civil War's shadow, we could probably learn a lot about how North American borders came to be where they are today, and that would tell us a lot about everything from immigration to Americans' views of themselves, to what is or is not exceptional about America, to uniquely distinctive things about Mexico, for instance. So it's an interesting question to close with.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We've about hit the end of our time. I appreciate all the people who've submitted questions, and I'm sorry I was not able to get to all of them. I'd like to remind everybody that by signing up for this webinar, you will be receiving an email with a link to the video recording of this session, as well as links to books written by our esteemed guests here today. So you can certainly go and learn quite a bit more. Obviously, this is a conflict that is very much a part of life and memory of the American West and borderlands, and remains significant to this day. So I'm glad that we had this opportunity to chat about it and learn more. And I'm grateful again to the National Association of Scholars and to Chris Kendall for putting this together and bringing us together, and to our panelists, David Heidler, Robert Mary, and John Pinheiro for sharing your insights. And of course, we can't do a thing like this without an audience. I mean, I guess we could, it just wouldn't be any fun. So again, thank you to all of you who have signed up for this, and I hope that this was a good learning experience for everyone as well. So unless anyone else has any final words, I guess we can bid farewell and have a safe and healthy rest of the day. Bye now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.